Hello, I'm Joan Brown. It's my great pleasure to host this segment of the Marin Women's Hall of Fame show. Since 1987, the Hall of Fame has inducted over 140 women of distinction, women who have made immense contributions to the county of Marin and its residents, as well as to the world beyond. Honorees have distinguished themselves in many fields: education, science, business, philanthropy, the arts, politics, law, philosophy, and religion. Each honoree has been a force for positive change in our community. It's with great pleasure to acknowledge and document their contributions. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Paola Gianturco, who is being honored in 2017 for her pioneering work as a photojournalist. So it's great to have you, Paola.
Thank you.
And I understand that you grew up in a family where your physician dad put a camera in your hands when you were about 8 years old, and your mom really influenced you to pursue writing, but you had a grandfather who had a lot of influence. Can you tell us about that?
I had a grandfather and a grandmother who had a lot of influence, even though I didn't meet them. They lived in Italy long ago. My grandfather was born in a tiny village in the Arch of the Boot, the son of a cobbler. They were very poor. He was elected to be a member of parliament in 1890, about 20 years after Italy was unified. And my grandmother wrote a diary about their life. They were married that week that he was elected. She, because Italy was newly unified, used to wear the costumes of the provinces where they campaigned. People loved her. They elected him, and he was serially Minister of Education and Transportation, unified both in Italy. You'll see my name on schools and train stations.
And this is for all of Italy, not his province.
All of Italy.
Wow.
And ultimately, he was head of the equivalent in Italy of the Supreme Court. What he did for fun was write symphonies. And that's how I met my grandmother. She was also at music school. After he finished law school, he went to music school. And all of their 9 children were required to play instruments. My father was tone deaf. He used to practice down in the basement. But my father was a genius. My father came to the United States as a fellow at the Mayo Clinic at age 25, having already finished his specialties in radiology and surgery and pathology. And he and 6 of his friend fellows at the Mayo Clinic went to the middle of Illinois and started a clinic and hospital on the Mayo model. And my mother, unable to find a job teaching English, was working as the bookkeeper in the clinic.
And this was in Champaign-Urbana?
In Champaign-Urbana,
That's where the University of Illinois is.
That's exactly right.
Interesting.
And my mother, who was engaged to somebody else, took one look at this dashing Italian doctor with his flying scarves and broke her engagement, and they fell in love and got married. So my mother, I have her high school yearbooks in which she was already writing stories. My mother, like my grandmother, loved writing. My grandmother had written not only the diary, but letters to the editor. She wrote her husband's speeches. My mother wrote when she was very young, even still in high school, and continued to write. So I think that I have in my blood social justice and the idea of writing. My brother is also a writer. He's written 3 books. So the very best present that my brother ever gave my family for Christmas was a bookshelf in which there were a dictionary and a thesaurus and all kinds of reference books, because we argued all the time about words, which we all loved. And to this day, my iPhone provides that service. All of us love words. So it led naturally to writing for me.
So was your father a photographer too? Why did he put a camera in your hands?
My father was definitely a photographer. As a radiologist, he took pictures of people's insides and took pictures for himself of the outside world because he thought it was beautiful.
So you began your career in marketing and advertising, and you ended up being like the corporate marketing director for iMagnin at the time when they started for the first time marketing to working women. And then you went into advertising for the first all-female firm in LA, and were there, 7 or 8 years after your term. And I'm wondering, I mean, your biography has very impressive titles in it. And it's not, and you were in groundbreaking organizations. Can you talk to us about that? And if you hit glass ceilings or help shatter them, or how this all evolved and what your influence was and how it influenced you?
Actually, I was corporate public relations director for Joseph Magnin.
Oh, Joseph Magnin,
which was the first chain of stores that catered to working women in the 1960s. Yeah. And then I worked with Hall and Levine Advertising, which was the first women-owned advertising agency in the country, probably in the world, founded in 1959. I got there in the early 60s. And both experiences were very exciting. I was at Hall and Levine for 14 years. During the time at Joseph Magnin, we were really breaking ground. It was a store chain that was completely unlike any other retailer. Very creative, wonderful, stylish ads done by a woman named Betty Breeder Ashley. Fabulous boxes at Christmas time that were shaped in odd and remarkable shapes. People came to buy gifts at the Joseph Magnin because they were so imaginative. And the merchandising was very fresh and very young and very attractive to the new generation of working women, of which, of course, I was one. So I was very fortunate to get to become their store-wide corporate public relations director. Cyril Magnin, who was the founder, said to me after I finished their training program, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I would like to be corporate public relations director." And the woman who had just left. She'd come from Vogue. She was 35 and very sophisticated, I thought. And he said, "Can you write an annual report?" I'd never read an annual report. And I said, "Yes."
How old were you at this point?
I was 22.
Uh-huh.
So we were operating in a completely new world. There were no precedents, and there were virtually no limits, and the Magnin family let those of us who were very young and full of ideas have free rein.
So you didn't feel there was a glass ceiling at JM?
Certainly there was not.
That's great.
And certainly at the women-owned advertising agency, which was Hall and Levine Advertising in Los Angeles, there certainly was no glass ceiling. In fact, at one point the government sent us a letter saying that we had to hire men.
Reverse discrimination?
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
But we did some things which I think because we were women, we were inspired to do that men might not have done.
And was there a sense of collaboration instead of competition, or not? Was there the corporate culture?
There was both.
I would imagine that there was.
There was both competition and collaboration. But we did some interesting things. I mean, all of us were unified by the idea that women should not be represented in advertising the way they were being represented, which was in their bedroom slippers with curlers in their hair, pushing their shopping carts down the grocery aisle. And looking around at the neighborhood, which was a very ethnically mixed neighborhood, we said, let's ask everybody to bring box lunches and we'll have music in the park. And for the first time, everybody came out of their apartment buildings where they had been kind of isolated. So we did lots of community service things that I think probably happened because we were all women working together. Also, when the law passed allowing employees stock ownership trusts, we were one of the first companies in the country to start one because we felt strongly that the women who were working with us and the men who ultimately joined us should have a stake in the company. But that was very early.
So I'm going to skip over some stuff. You left them and you had your own private consulting firm, and you worked like crazy and for years and were exhausted and decided to take a sabbatical. And it looks like at this point in your life that sabbatical changed your life. Can you tell us about that?
Well, we skipped over an important 9 years at Saatchi & Saatchi, and in the last of those years, I was also teaching at Stanford a course that a friend and I developed called Women and Leadership.
Well, and that's your alma mater also.
It is. And we were doing an executive summer institute for senior women at corporations all over the country. And the effect was that after we had taught about 12 times, in addition to the consulting that I was doing for Saatchi, I was exhausted. I had earned 2 years of money in 1 year because I was in fact doing 2 jobs, and I had millions of frequent flyer miles. And that meant I could go, I had bought myself a year, and I could fly and stay, because hotels accept frequent flyer miles too. I could fly and stay virtually anywhere in the world. So I decided to take a 1-year leave of absence and do a coffee table book, which was my dream. Some people would have said that was a harebrained scheme because I was not a professional photographer and I was not a professional writer. I was in the business side of advertising. So this idea of going off to do a coffee table book about women around the world was in fact a pretty wild approach to the next chapter.
So how did you get that initial idea? Why did you want to do a coffee table book about women?
I was always interested in women's issues, as you can imagine, given this career path and being a woman. But I was very interested as a result of the Beijing conference. I was teaching at Stanford during the Beijing conference. All of us were watching. And during that conference, the research was revealed that said women all over the developing world were sending their children to school with the money they earned. In many cultures, men were given the prerogative to spend on what they wanted, radios and bicycles and so forth. But women were feeding and educating the children, and I thought, they are heroic. I wanted to talk to them.
And which was your first book?
This was the first book, In Her Hands, Craftswomen Changing the World. I focused on craftswomen. I had collected folk art for a long time. I thought I should know something about this project I was doing. So a friend of mine, a woman I had worked with at Hall & Levine Advertising in Los Angeles, and I collaborated to do this book
and
in 12
was
countries.
So popular that was put into paperback, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
Well, that was because we were on the Oprah Winfrey show.
Yes.
And zoom, that was the end of the hardcover.
Fabulous. So you found a lot of success as an author. You've had 5 gorgeous, impactful books published by a well-known publisher. You've been on NPR, Oprah Winfrey, CNN. You were one of 40 women over 40 to watch, and you got another.
When I was 73.
When you were 73, yesterday. You did a TED Talk in Dubai. You've had numerous other recognitions and awards. Did you expect this kind of international acclaim? What's it feel like? What kinds of doors are open for you now that might not have been open with book 1? Just talk a couple minutes about that, if you will.
Book 1 was a learning curve that went straight up.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, I knew nothing about what I was trying to do. And so I had to figure out how to find a publisher. First, I had to find an agent. Then I had to find a publisher. The agent said, you have to have a museum exhibit. I'd never had a museum exhibit or any kind of exhibit, but I knew how to write proposals, so I wrote proposals and sent it to all the museums I knew about, and the Field Museum in Chicago said yes, they would have an exhibit based on In Her Hands, and later they also had an exhibit based on celebrating women. So this was not expected, and in fact, it happened as a result of working 12 to 14 hours every single day to try to figure out how on earth to do what I wanted to do. It was all new. It was like jumping into the swimming pool without waiting to see if there was any water.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very brave, very courageous. You donate all of the proceeds of your books to philanthropic causes. If you don't mind sharing with our audience, how much does that amount to? How do you pick the organizations? How does all that happen?
I'll just give some examples. Women Who Light the Dark, 100% of the royalties went to the Global Fund for Women. Grandmother Power, which was about activist grandmothers, that's the newest one. 100% of the author royalties went to the Stephen Lewis Foundation in Canada, which has organized 8,000 Canadian grandmothers to raise money to help grandmothers in 15 African countries who are raising children orphaned by AIDS. So I look very carefully for nonprofit organizations that are run by women and that benefit women and that work internationally.
So which comes first, the idea for the book or the organization?
Oh, always the idea for the book.
And how does it move from, how do you select your topics? How does it go from the crafts to the, and all the way through to the
They are
grandmothers?
linked, I'll tell you, from crafts to celebrating women. I was packing up my cameras in India, which was the last chapter that we did for In Her Hands. And the women whom we had just interviewed said, come back in the fall and we'll show you how to do the dances that we do all night to honor the Mother God. And I thought, I am coming.
Okay.
And then I began to research festivals that celebrate women, and despite the fact that in many cultures women are denigrated and discounted, in fact, they are celebrated in many places, and so that was the second book.
So, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm just so curious, and I imagine our watchers are too. You didn't just take your camera and go. Did you have countries figured out that you wanted to go to? Did you have contacts? How did you get contacts? Did you land cold in a country and say, here I am?
Never. I probably spent a year researching each of these books. I knew exactly what stories, I'm a journalist. I knew what stories were news. I had already contacted the organizations and obtained their agreement to participate. And they knew that I wanted to interview women in their homes, not...
And is everyone in your, are all of the people in your, I mean, you've been 60 countries, I think. Are you connected or linked to an organization in each one of those places?
Yes.
Great.
So often they are the ones who provide an interpreter, because obviously I don't speak 62 languages. But the women are always very open. That was the surprise of doing this work. I had expected that because I was coming from a country where people think there is gold in the streets. I was very well educated, and many of these women are illiterate. I thought there would be a barrier, but there never was, because women are listened to so little around the world that the fact I had come from so far just to talk to them and hear them meant they would tell me almost anything.
Well, it's also your warmth and your empathy, too. I'm sure that you
Thank you.
have earned that success. Talk more about your grandmother power. You are a powerful grandmother. There are many powerful grandmothers in Marin County. What are things that can be kind of pulled from this book and transferred into Marin County to activate the grandmother power we have here?
Grandmothers have incredible power, and they're exercising it around the world. That was the news behind that book. There are now more grandmothers in the world than there have ever been in the history of mankind, because we're living longer. For a long time, people didn't live longer than 30. In the United States today, there are 42 million grandmothers, and an incredible number of new grandmothers every day, and they're younger than they've ever been. The average age of a new grandmother is 47 in the United States. And
Wait. The average age
of a first-time grandmother is 47, and the majority of grandmothers, thanks to the boomers, are between 45 and 64. So these are women who grew up in the 60s. They know how to change things because they did. Think about how much change occurred in the 60s, thanks to people who were in school then, here and around the world. So these are grandmothers who understand activism. Many of them have had working careers, so they understand how to be effective. And they're ambitious about what they want the world to be like for their grandchildren. So they get to work, and they are very powerful.
So what are some of the things that they're doing? What is your favorite story or two from the book and from what's going on in the U.S.?
One favorite story from the book is about grandmothers in India who were illiterate rural grandmothers who went to the Barefoot College in Rajasthan and learned how to be solar engineers. And they went back to their villages, dark villages, and put a solar panel on top of every hut. Changed everything. People could see to walk around at night. It was safe. Midwives could deliver babies in the middle of the night. Kids could study without getting lung diseases from kerosene lanterns. People could charge their cell phones and do electronic banking. Everything changed. So the UN heard about this and began sending grandmothers from other countries to study with the Indian grandmothers. They had no common language. So I was there when 20 grandmothers arrived from 10 African countries. And the grandmothers from India taught by demonstration and experimentation and diagrams and color coding. It was an astonishing thing to watch. And now, thanks to the UN sending women from literally all over the world, there are villages that have light in 77 countries, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America.
Interesting. And what do you see grandmothers doing here in the U.S.?
I see grandmothers here in the U.S. doing less, interestingly enough. They may be engaged locally and involved with volunteer work and with nonprofit organizations in their local communities, but they tend, with the exception of the raging grannies, there's a whole chapter about the raging grannies in Grandmother Power, they tend to be not as organized as they are in other countries.
And do you think that's because there's less need or less view? What do you think? What is that about?
I think this just hasn't caught on here yet. Or because they can be effective in freestanding organizations that are not driven by grandmothers alone. There isn't any particular need for that here yet.
What are some of the most surprising things that you came across in your travels in creating these 5 wonderful books?
I think I've been surprised by how little, on the one hand, and how much, on the other hand, women have in common around the world. Really, the only 2 things that I've discovered that women everywhere seem to share is that they always have hopes for their children and grandchildren and hope that their lives will be better than their own lives have been, and they work very, very hard to make that happen. And the other thing is domestic violence, which literally happens everywhere. I mean, probably the worst place I have been where domestic violence constitutes 77% is in the South Pacific. But the UN says that internationally, 1 out of every 3 women is beaten. So unfortunately, that is a shared and common experience virtually everywhere.
And are any of the potential solutions for that covered in any of these books?
Yes, Women Who Light the Dark, which is about women who are running nonprofit organizations, includes a chapter in Vietnam, a woman who was, as a matter of fact, a commentator, just as you are today, a woman who worked for the radio station, the government radio station, heard so many stories about women being beaten that she started the first hotline in Hanoi. and then started an NGO which now runs 22 cities worth of hotlines. They get 5,000 calls a day.
Wow. So, wrapping it up and bringing it to Marin County, what advice would you have for women in Marin, and particularly younger women in Marin, about how they can be truly engaged in their community and be supportive of other women? And how do you get from a very busy life to being engaged in community? And what do you get back for doing that?
I think we have a real opportunity for women and girls in Marin right now, because some things which I value very much are being threatened. One is gender equality, and the other one is multicultural understanding. It seems to me that those are issues which deserve to be defended and championed, and that all of us need to collaborate in that effort, because it's those aspects of life that in fact are the linchpins of democracy and justice and peace.
Thank you, Paola, for sharing your stories with incredible life with us. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in. The Marin Women's Hall of Fame is a project of the YWCA of San Francisco and Marin. If you would like to learn more about the Hall of Fame and our honorees, please visit www.ywcasf-marin.org. Thank you very much.